Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class on pen and ink drawing techniques and exercise in implied line. Tonight's class is 90 minutes in length, although it may have said 60 minutes on the website when you signed up. And going forward, all of my classes with Michaels will be 90 minutes long, and I'll be doing 3 classes a month instead of 4 classes a month. So we've got a lot of time tonight to dig into the concept of implied line. And next week's class, we will be talking about line weight. So we'll be using blind contour line drawing technique to practice line weight. So tonight's class and next week's class are very similar in structure, in that I'm kind of using a certain device to help you understand a drawing concept. And I'm just going to read directly from the class description for tonight, because I feel like there may be a lot of questions about what we're doing based on the timed exercises that we're going to be doing. And just in case you didn't read that long paragraph in the class description. So the reference images, let me read that first sentence. So the instructor will lead a series of timed drawing exercises using 3 subjects. The reference images of these subjects, a feather, 2 roses, and a Luna moth, are provided in the supply list. For example, there will be 12 minutes to draw a feather, then 7 minutes to draw the same feather, then 4 minutes, 2 minutes, and finally 1 minute to draw the feather. I feel like I'm reading like the rules of a game right now. It is a bit of a game. I always feel like whenever I do this in a class that it has kind of like a an upbeat, like, fun aspect to it. At least I think it's fun. Some people feel like it's a lot of pressure with these timed exercises. And so that's why I wanted to read this last part of the class description. These timed drawing exercises are not intended to glorify the act of drawing faster. These exercises are simply one way to help an artist identify the key lines in a subject that will suggest the subject to a viewer using implied lines. The act of drawing the same subject repeatedly helps the artist better understand the values and shapes of the subject so that they may capture the subject in a more loose and effortless way. So think about the word implied. If you're like, what the heck is implied line drawing and what does that mean? Think about whenever you imply something in a story, like you're gossiping about somebody and you don't want other people around you to hear, everything, like every part of the story. Like maybe you're telling a more grown-up story in front of children, right? You may suggest something to the person you're telling the story to without actually saying certain words, or you make facial expressions or something. You're implying something, and then you're expecting that the person who's listening to that story is paying attention enough to like gather the missing information. A connect the dots drawing would be a similar thing. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're trying to get the idea of implied line drawing, which is when you're drawing with pen and ink, you really want to leave some areas blank. You want to kind of hover over the page. You want this kind of like loose illustrator style to happen. I mean, I've been teaching pen and ink drawing for almost 10 years to adults, and that is, the thing that everybody's striving for, and it's the hardest thing to teach because it really comes with practice. So this exercise is just kind of like a built-in practice. It's going to take us an hour and a half to get through these timed drawings of these 3 different subjects. And by the end of it, hopefully, or even maybe by the end of one of these subject exercises, you're gonna be like, oh, I see, like the implied line sketching is starting to happen. And if it's not, then that just means that you need more practice with this. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to my tabletop view, and I'm going to save questions tonight until the end of the class, and or maybe in between the drawing exercises. We'll see how we're doing on time. So I want to make sure that we have enough time to squeeze in all of the timed exercises here. But we're using a set of Illustrator pens, so the Artist Loft, permanent ink pens, Illustrator pens, I forget exactly what they're called, or I've got the Faber-Castell. You could use micron pens. You could really use any pen that you have on hand. I'm not going to be drawing I'm not going to be drawing in pencil first. If you want to draw in pencil first, then by all means, grab your pencils. But I've just got my pens, and then I've got this small Canson sketchbook that I put on the supply list. And then we have these reference images. Let me get them pulled up on my iPad here. So I just got all three of them in one. Oops, accidentally go into my kids' photo gallery there. So I'm just going to zoom in on each one individually here, and I will set the timer on my iPhone. I prefer to have a kitchen timer for this, but I'm going to use my iPhone tonight. So we've got the feather, we've got these two roses, and then we've got this Luna moth. Excuse me. So those are our three subjects that we are drawing from this evening, and those should have been included in the supply list. All right, don't forget to tag your work with those hashtags, Make It With Michael's or Michael's Classes. If you post anything, online from tonight, you can also follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art. I'm also on Facebook, Adrienne Hodge Fine Art. And here's some of my same business cards I'm always flashing on screen with my some of my paintings that I do using calligraphy ink. Okay, so we're just gonna dive in here, but first I'm gonna show you my examples of all of these in my sketchbook. So I wrote over here in the margin of the sketchbook, this was my 12 minutes of the quail feather, and then I wrote the nib sizes that I used. So I used the 0.05 nib for Faber-Castell, the 0.3 and the 0.5. And then I put the date. You don't have to write all this. This was my 7-minute sketch. This is my 4-minute sketch, 2 minutes. And then each one I was using a little bit bigger nib. So, and I'll talk about this as we get, as we roll through this, but mainly I want to point out that by the time I get to the 2-minute and the 1-minute sketch, using a bigger nib like a brush pen is a great idea. So make sure you have a brush pen in your little toolkit tonight, and that was on the supply list as well. And then I got some other sketches here before I decided to use the two roses. So this was, I ended up doing 15 minutes for the dried roses here, 8 minutes, 3 minutes, and 1 minute. So we'll see how much time we have. And then the Luna moth, I did 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 1 minute. And each time I'm switching to a thicker nib pen, or by the last one, maybe a brush tip pen. And you can see how, the drawings maybe get a little less detailed, but like comparing my 10-minute of the Luna moth to my 1-minute sketch, there's less details, but there's a greater understanding that I'm having at that point about what the most essential lines of that Luna moth are, in order to suggest, that to the viewer. So what are the most essential parts of that story to tell your story without saying, all the details? And that may be hard to do right off the bat, but when you study an image repeatedly like this, it begins to become more clear. Okay, so that's what we're doing. Hopefully that answers any initial questions you may have about the class structure. Oh, and then I got another example here. I did this in an in-person class with a tree outside in my urban sketching class. That was my tree in 10 minutes. And then I'm assuming that was 5 to maybe 7, 8 minutes, and then maybe 4 minutes, and then 1 minute or 2 minutes. So, a greater understanding happens, less detail, but, you're becoming more familiar with the subject as we go on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Let me pull up the quail feather image, and I'll try to keep it on the screen at the same time, but you have the image. So hopefully you're going to be drawing from your version of the image, because on Zoom, it's washing out quite a bit of information there, or it seems to be. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to talk us through it as I'm doing this here. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started. And I like to start when I'm sketching with pens only. I like to start with my smallest nib pen. And that is because I can kind of use the lighter lines on the pen to, you know, draw nice and light. So I'm looking for my extra small pen here, my 0.05, and then I'll just kind of see what feels right as we go along here. We're already 12 minutes in. So I'm gonna set a timer for 12 minutes. We may not do the exact same time restraint for all of these. Like I might adjust it as we go. But I'm gonna go ahead and set a timer for 12 minutes. I accidentally had 30 seconds on there. So we got 12 and a half minutes here. And I'm starting with my smallest nib pen. And this is just an exercise. So hopefully nobody's feeling any pressure to have, a perfect anything. Like that's the whole point of this, drawing it repeatedly, is that we're not putting a whole lot of pressure on ourselves for any one of these drawings. But I know that that's hard for those of us who struggle with perfectionism. I struggle with it too, in a lot of ways. So, but I'm just starting with the larger shape of the feather, maybe doing like, if you want to do this part with pencil, you're welcome to do that. But, I kind of know what I'm doing at this point in my life with my drawing abilities. So I don't really need this exercise to figure out what the implied line shapes are. So I'm kind of starting with that, but you start with whatever makes the most sense to you. Going general to specific, getting the big shapes in there is a good way to start. So I'm looking at all these like feathery bits. It's a great descriptive word for this feather. It's feathery. The feather was feathery. No points in for me if that was my answer on an English test. Describe the feather. The feather was feathery, soft and wispy. There's some other words in there, but yeah, getting all those like wispy bits to happen. And I'm using less pressure on my pen. I just realized our wonderful moderator, Chanel, and I were chit-chatting before the class, and I forgot to tell her some classes that we might reference tonight, but I bet you still have them on hand, Chanel. The one from last week on the pen and ink shading techniques for anybody who's just jumping in and needs some help with, learning to draw with pen and ink. We had a class or two classes. Well, no, I guess it was just one. It was the first part was contour lines with the limes. And then the second one was a recent class where we reviewed all the pen and ink shading techniques. So that would be a good one because we talked all about, using smaller versus bigger nibs and, less pressure versus more pressure. All right, so I'm getting in here more detailed and I'm looking at the shapes of this color shift. This is a synthetic feather, by the way. It's supposed to be a quill feather, but I purchased these feathers. This was not anyway, I don't know why I feel like saying that, but it's this little like light turquoise shape that I'm seeing in there. That's what I'm sketching in right now. So I'm kind of sketching the empty shape of that different color shift that's happening there from light to dark. And then I left some gaps. So, in this first drawing, we're kind of just now getting acquainted with this image and with our subject. And by the time we get to the 1 minute version of this, we're going to be, maybe not experts on the subject, but we're going to be much more acquainted with it. And we're going to understand, maybe where to get started or that's the whole point of this exercise, is to like figure out what the most essential lines are, right? But right now, you know, it may be a slow start. And we have about 8.5 minutes left on this sketch. I'm going to go ahead and switch to a bigger nib pen. Another one that comes in this Faber-Castell set is the FH, which stands for, what does the FH stand for? It says pen fewed nib hard. Oh, okay. It's the hard fewed nib. I love this one. It's so nice. And yeah, if you want to write off to the side in the margins which pen nib you used to remember it later. So that was the 0.05. And then now I'm using this thicker one. And I'm just going to go ahead, since I feel like I was kind of talking a lot and it's already 8.5 minutes in. I'm going to go ahead and put some darker shapes in here. So I'll say this repeatedly throughout this evening's class. The main thing that you want to be looking for in these sketches are, you know, those most essential shapes and lines, and looking for the absolute darks, like the 10 on the value scale, where it goes to absolute black. Like, what is the large shape where it goes super dark? And that maybe is not jumping out at you right away, and maybe you've got to sketch it for a while. When I do this in an in-person class, I always encourage people with this first sketch, you know, like I did with you, to start with your pencil first if you feel more comfortable starting with the pencil. But by now, since we're you know, getting to be halfway through, because it's already 6.5 minutes left now, just while I was talking, 2 minutes went by. So if you haven't switched to the pen yet, I would go ahead and switch to the pen. And I'm starting to fill in some of those darker shapes. Also, there's no like goal here other than to get an understanding of implied line. So you don't have to finish these sketches. I wouldn't consider every sketch that I just showed you from the you know, my demonstrations from before for the advertisements for the class. I wouldn't consider all of those to be finished. Plus, I don't like the word finished like ever, honestly. I think finished is such a relative term, especially in a painting class. I never say finished. I always say developed. Like, it feels like you could develop it further, or I really honestly love things that are, you know, look undeveloped or unfinished. So I'm just going for, you know, it to feel a little more developed by the end of this 12 minutes. And that is also a subjective term, but finished, I feel like, just puts pressure on people, unnecessary pressure. So whatever I can do to help remove that unnecessary pressure that you put on yourself when you're drawing is what I'm here to do for you. But the main concept of implied line is really about, like, what are the most essential shapes and lines that will suggest this subject to our viewer. And those are hard to see at first, but the, you know, deeper we go into it, maybe they'll jump out to you. But right now, it's like the 10 shapes are everything I'm filling in, everywhere where it goes to absolute 10. So those are definitely some of the most essential shapes, because they, in order to suggest what, you know, the subject is to your viewer, because they're the ones that you would see if you held this image out. You know, if I were to stand 20 feet away with this image and hold it up and show it to you, you're going to see the darkest darks and the lightest lights from that far across the room, that far away from you. So those are the shapes that I think, or that I know, would describe this image to a viewer the fastest in an implied way. So I'm looking for those shapes now that we're closing in on 3.5 minutes left here, and then also the lightest light shapes. And I'm leaving those blank. So I'm leaving some areas blank. And if you don't have like the lightest light shapes outlined yet, those would be like where the light turquoise is in the feather, the space in between, like this really interesting little gap in between the feathers right here. That's an interesting one we could put in there. And then there's a few others right here. And all these like little wispy bits. There are some like really dark shapes right next to them that would really help the lighter wispiness pop out and create contrast. And that is what we're really going for in a loose kind of devil may care illustrated style. So in order to quickly capture that later, we want to identify that now and go ahead and fill those in this initial drawing, even though we've got more time. Let's see, what else? That's essentially it. I mean, we're looking for the darkest darks and the lightest lights. We're outlining where the light shapes are with a light nib pen, or we're, taking note of where they are and leaving them nice and light, and then trying to find a bit of contrast nearby by looking for some dark values, some dark shapes that are happening next to those lightest light shapes. So like right here at the end of the feather, how it gets really dark right here, like leaving it kind of open, leaving like a gap there on purpose because it looks cool. And if you already made it a solid line right there, the next time we draw it, you can try to make it more of a lighter open-ended thing. I'm going to switch to an 07 nib here a little bit just to mix it up and get some variety in my line weight, which is something we're going to talk about next week, which is just the variation in the heaviness, the thickness and thinness of the line. So by using some different nib pens here, I'm getting a variety of thickness and thinness to my lines, and that's creating, hopefully creating some texture. It's also kind of fun to have some of these like little flyaway bits implied here. And you can do that with, any of the nibs that you prefer, but I thought I'd just try a couple with like what was that? I've got the 0.3 here now, and I think that was the 0.5 I just used, and then I used the FH. Okay, that was our 12-minute sketch. So we're going to go ahead and flip the page, and we're going to draw this little quail feather again, but this time we're going to do it in 7 minutes. So started the timer for 7 minutes. This time I'm going to start with my my small nib instead of my extra small, because I want to inspire you to be a little more confident each time with these. And even if, the first mark that you make with a thicker nib pen is not the exact, one that you want to make, or if something is a little off, that's okay, because it's just an exercise. Any pressure that you feel to have a product when you're working on your art is, completely self-assigned, in my opinion. I really approach almost everything as process-based. So I am not a product-based person, but I do a lot of commissions. So there is one area of my life where I have to be more product-based, or if I have a class where we're kind of making like a takeaway item, then, you know, it's baked into the sauce. But I still, even in that, like to remind people that, you know, if it doesn't turn out the way you want it to, then you just call it an exercise, call it another day of practice. So I also kind of hover my pen over the page, and that is something that has taken me a lot of time to practice to get better at. Um, and then now I kind of do it a little more absent-mindedly. But if you could, you know, if I could impart one suggestion for you to get better at this implied line technique, that would be to just kind of hover over the page with your pen. Just don't put your pen down all the way while you're drawing. And I've said that before in other classes when we're using pen and ink. Drawing with your entire arm is also really helpful with that. So we talked about that in last week's class. If you missed it on that intro to or graphite drawing, I cannot remember the name of the class. Graphite pencil basics, I believe. We talked at length about using your whole arm rather than. Okay, this is the 7-minute. I'm just going to write that I started with the 0.3 nib, and then I'm switching to that FH again because I like it. I just like the shape of that nib. It's really nice, and it's easy to turn it on its side. It's a little bit like a brush pen, but it's a hard and it's not quite as soft as the brush pen. But I like that you can turn it on its side and get a nice thick mark to happen, or I can use the tip of it and get a thinner mark to happen, just like a brush tip pen. And we've had several classes where we've used brush tip pens. I cannot think of any of the titles of them off the top of my head, but I know we have used a lot of, if you just search pen and ink in my name on YouTube, you can find all the pen and ink classes that we've done, and the brush tip pen has worked its way into a lot of them. So I feel like there was a very recent one and now it's just escaping me. Oh, you know what? It was the pen and ink one with the limes. We used the Tombow brush tip pen. All right, we got 3 minutes left right on the dot here. So this is where I'm like, hopefully don't panic when it's like, oh my gosh, only 3 minutes left here. This is where we're like, all right, where were those big shadow shapes? Like if I'm trying to capture, which I just said, there's no product based goal here, and it's okay if it's unfinished, but if I were going to try to capture everything I did in this sketch as I did in the last one, that would be where were those like really dark values. So maybe this FH nib is not cutting it, and I want to go to my one of my brush tips. I'm gonna use the small brush SB, and I can quickly fill in some of those dark shapes really fast with the brush tip pen. And it's not going to have the same effect as it did when I added all that, interesting texture with all the different nibs. But hey, we had, much less time to work on this one, to develop it. So it's okay. We're not going to get the exact same aesthetic with all of them. But I can still, quickly fill in some of those big shapes, and maybe I start to see like a stylized quality that I really like. The more you kind of play around with these other nibs, the more that could start to come about for you. And then there were those little wispy moments that are kind of dark that were hanging off. I want to try to capture some of those, create that contrast between light and dark. We got a minute left on this one, and I feel like I got pretty far. I feel like I captured almost everything, which I'm sure some of y'all are like, oh, good for you. I did that in an in-person class recently. My students were working on a very challenging process, and they had not gotten that far, and I started way after them because I was helping them to get started on theirs. And then I was like, well, I got really far in an hour over here at the end of the class. And they were like, oh, good for you. It was funny. Okay. Let's see. What do I want to try to add real quick in these last few seconds of this drawing? I'm pretty satisfied with how much I was able to capture in this 7-minute sketch. Skipping to a bigger nib pen really made huge difference for me here. All right, that was 7 minutes. I'm just going to write the other nibs that I used on this one, although I'm kind of forgetting what they were. The FH, and then I used the small brush. All right, now's where it really gets fun. Now we're going to do the same feather in 4 minutes. 4 minutes, and then we'll do 2 minutes and then 1 minute. And I've actually given us an extra 30 seconds on all of these, but I'm going to make it just 4 minutes on this one. And this time I'm going to start with a little bit bigger pen. I'm going to start with the 0.5. Last time I started with the 0.3, so I'm getting bigger and bigger with my pen. I'm starting with each time. Okay, I started the timer. Some of you maybe already started drawing. All right, so I got a bigger nib pen now. I always love when I'm doing this in person. I can't hear, any of y'all's sound, but I imagine that the pace is picking up. It's also kind of fun to play like upbeat music while I'm doing this, but we just got our silent drawing space here. But I love how the sounds of everybody's pens, just the movement is like audible, because then people just start drawing a little faster. Even though, like I said, the point of this drawing exercise is not to get faster, it's to get to be able to capture those most essential lines. But there is something about drawing faster or having less time that does help people to loosen up, in my opinion. And it also, well, we'll talk about that whenever we are done and we're kind of have some extra time at the end. I want to have a couple questions, like follow-up questions I always have for the audience after this exercise regarding how you felt, during these sketches. I'll just go ahead and tell you now, a lot of people report that they felt more pressure during the longer timed sketches than they did with the shorter timed sketches, that they felt more free. And some people report the opposite, but I do hear a lot of people saying that they felt kind of freed up with these less times, like it felt more fun. And that's definitely my intention here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and switch. I'm going to jump right to back to that small nib, small brush. We're going to go. So again, we're looking for those big 10 shapes, the absolute black shapes, and then where are those absolute light shapes? Make sure that you have at least established where the lightest light is. And I don't expect you to finish. We have 1.5 minutes left. But there are some interesting quirks that all of these subjects that we're drawing tonight have. There are some like these little spots up here on the feather. Those are interesting. I want to put those in there. I want to make sure I capture those. I want to make sure I capture like some of these gaps in the way the feather strands are like opened up in some moments. And I want to get some of those little wispy things because those were kind of those standout characteristics of this feather that we were focusing on a lot when we had more time. And then also, obviously, those big, as many as you can fill in of those solid 10, like the value that's going to like pop and create contrast. And it's likely when we have less time in these next couple of sketches, we're not going to have time to fill in these value shapes, but we are going to want to have a good understanding of the shapes themselves. So filling them in while we have more time will familiarize ourselves with them a little more. And it'll be easier to sketch the shapes themselves. Right. So again, no big deal if you didn't finish. It's just an exercise. I just want to write the nibs that I used. So it was the 0.5 and the small brush. Okay, so now 2 minutes on the clock. And for this one, I am only going to use my small nib. So I've started the clock. And now I am just sketching with the small nib only. So I'm going to go ahead and put that big gap in the feathers there. Go ahead and put the little wispy bits in there. I'm hovering with my brush pen, trying not to press down too hard. And then where it's thicker, I can use the side and try to get some of that interesting line weight we're going to talk about next week in there by just varying the pressure that I'm putting on this small brush nib. And then, yeah, let me go ahead and put those cool little dots that were showing up in the feather pattern. So I'm really just trying to capture the essence of those most essential lines and shapes here. Just got 40 seconds left. But in our next sketch, we're going to have just 1 minute. We're going to go ahead and practice capturing all these things as quickly as we can. We're just looking for like the bones of this feather now. What were the most interesting parts that were jumping out at us, or that we were focusing on when we had more time? All right. So that was our 2 minute. And then now we're going to do 1 minute. And I'm going to switch to my big brush nib for this one. All right, y'all ready? I bet a bunch of you already started. All right, 1 minute on the clock, starting now. People always start before me when I do this. And like if I wait too long, I'm like, I see you cheat. Not that there's any cheating. I'm just being funny, really. Okay, I got my little gap. I bet most of you are not watching what I'm doing right now. You're focused on your own drawing. Just looking for all those most essential lines and shapes. So that little base down here on the nib of the, like where we would put a pen nib if this feather was a pen. Some of the little wispy moments. We got 20 seconds left. That big wispy thing. And we put some of those dots up there. Those were fun. Maybe one of those big shapes. 7 seconds left. Done. Okay, that was 1 minute with a brush pen. All right, you'll want to hold up some of your feather sketches and let me see how those turned out. We can spotlight you real quick. We'll do this in between all of them. We're gonna do a little, we'll vary our time. Ooh, look at that. I love it. That looks like a longer sketch, maybe the 12-minute there. That's gorgeous. Oh, look at that. I love it when they're all on one page and you can see that progression. Okay, yeah, look at, I love the 2-minute. A lot of times that 2-minute one is people's favorites. The 2-minute really has some nice effect going there. Ooh, look at that one. Yes, that's an implied line drawing of a feather. Totally. Nailed it. That was the 1 minute. That's gorgeous. These are all so lovely. Really doing a great job. All right, let's spotlight maybe one more and then we'll move on to the roses. That's beautiful. Love all the detail in that one. Okay. Let me get back to my tabletop here. Okay, so let me pull up the picture of the roses. All right, I'm going to turn my sketchbook horizontal for these since it's such a horizontal image, so I might have to go off screen. But you all have the rose picture, so it'd be pretty hard for me to get my drawing and the roses on there, keeping it turned to the side like that. Okay, let's see. It's 6:45. I wanted us to have at least that full time for all of these. Let's do 10 minutes. Or no, let's do 12 minutes for this one, but we'll shorten it when we get to the subsequent drawings, because yeah, these roses do take some time to study. So we'll start with 12 minutes for the roses, and then we may just end up I keep forgetting we've got 45 more minutes till the end of the class, but I also want to leave time to answer some questions at the end and see your drawings. So I just want to give us a little bit of cushion. Okay, I started the timer, and since we've already been drawing for a while and I've built up my confidence, and hopefully you have as well, I'm not going to start with that extra small, but I'm going to start with the small. All right, so this time maybe you want to start with the absolute 10 values. So, and these roses have, they're pretty complicated little subjects here, and they're turned on their side. So we've got these big shadows. There's a lot to look at. And we've also got the, little leaves that have dried on these dried roses. So, again, however you want to start to capture them, if you want to start with your pencil first to get comfortable. There's even some dust on the side of these roses, you may notice. If anybody has ever given me flowers, I still have them. I dry and keep almost every flower a person has ever given me. And I just love having dried. Maybe noticed there's some on the table behind me, my kitchen table. So sometimes they get a little dusty. I also have like a big jar where I put a bunch of dried roses, make my own little potpourri out of them. Anyway, just explaining why there's dust on these roses here, because they've maybe been around for a while. Okay, so the relationship of these roses to each other is important. If you're struggling to just like capture the kind of perspective of them, look at the space in between them to kind of how they connect to help you to, capture the perspective. But yeah, if you're struggling with the perspective of them or capturing them, just know that, they are tricky. And the more you kind of treat it like a little implied line sketch from the beginning, if you're starting with your pen only, the more successful you might be. You also might notice there's like a diagonal line here between the shadows, so you can kind of line it up with a diagonal like that. So noticing that diagonal may help you to line them up in a way that feels like the roses, but also we're just trying to capture the essence of them. I picked 3 subjects that I felt like were very organic and open to interpretation on purpose. I had tried, I do this exercise with a lot of different subject matter, still life objects, particularly, and some still life objects are not as fun to do this with as others. So I definitely picked things that like have a bit of like an essence or a soul to them, where like even if you don't capture exactly what they look like, maybe you're still going to capture, like the essence of them and be satisfied with your drawing on that level. So, just again, don't put unnecessary pressure on yourself. So I'm going to go ahead. We're at 8 minutes now, and I'm going to try to capture these shadow shapes, and then I'm going to jump to a bigger nib pen here. So just really trying to capture that diagonal of the shadows, how they line up in a bit of a diagonal line there. And then now that I've kind of gotten the essence of the general shape of both of them, now I'm going to start looking in more detail at those darker values. I'm going to switch to that FH nib that I like so much. I'm going to write down that I was using the 0.3 first. And so now I'm looking at where are those absolute, y'all are getting my strategy now. So where are those 10 values shapes? Those are what are going to help us capture the essence of this form more quickly when we have less and less time. So the quicker we can go ahead and identify them and start to fill them in, the easier it's going to be when we have less time. Not that speed drawing is being glorified here, but it also is a technique that carries over when you have more time. The more you practice it, and having that time constraint just forces people to just be a little less precious with it, to just loosen up, because that's essentially what you got to do is loosen up. And if you're being super tight with your drawing all the time, then you know what I mean. And so this is just an exercise to help you loosen up. I really like the scribble technique to fill in the center of these roses here. But you might do like hatching or cross hatching right here as well. I was using a lot of hatching lines on the feather, and I just realized I never really named that. But here, I might start to describe some of those contours a little bit. You might do a little bit of stippling. Stippling definitely takes more time, but it can create a fun little aesthetic. Got 5 minutes left, and I've been focusing on that other rose quite a bit. So I'm going to come over here and look for the most essential dark shapes on this rose. Also, I said something earlier in the other timed drawings that I wanted to give credit to an artist friend of mine who's also an amazing art teacher who teaches some classes here in Austin. His name is Jorge Palomares, and he used to be my studio neighbor ages ago. And one time I was working on a painting and it just was not looking like I wanted it to. I didn't feel like I was capturing the subject. And he asked me for my source image and I gave it to him on my phone and he went and stood about, 15 feet away from me and held up the image and said, "What about this image drew you to it?" And I was like, "Say no more." Like just from him doing that, I knew exactly what my painting needed because from that far away, I could see these strong contrasting light and dark shapes. And that's what drew me to the image. And so I immediately knew what I needed to do to my painting to, you know, make it stand out, to make it have what it was missing. So that's why I was saying, what would those shapes be, if we looked at the image from across the room? That was so helpful that day. And I use that quite a bit with my students. So we have 3.5 minutes left on this more detailed timed drawing. And I feel like now I'm remembering why I added 3 more minutes and did 15 minutes with my practice sketch on this one. Okay, here's how I'm going to fill in these shadow shapes really quickly. I'm just going to use a diagonal hatching line to fill in the shadow shape really quickly. And maybe we could even have used my brush nib to do this even faster. But it's okay. However far we get is how far we get. Switch to my brush nib for a bit here and see if I can make it a little more drama. This is such a dramatic image. Okay, so yeah, there's some shadows on these leaves. It gets pretty dark on these little leaves sticking out. So capturing all those little moments. And yeah, here's where stippling would be really nice if you have the time to add a little bit of stippling. I mean, it almost looks like the coloration on the rose, like it feels stippled. The texture of it itself feels stippled on the color shift. So adding some stippling just makes sense. Nice to fill in some of the, oh yeah, I got 1.5 minutes time. Fill in some of these other shadows that the petals are creating when they're falling across the body of the rose. Maybe you could add a little bit of like some contour lines to get a nice little practice in about the contour shifts that are happening. Maybe add some scribbling or some other interesting textures. I feel like this drawing right now is a little all over the place, but it's kind of a study for what I'm going to do when I'm going to have less time. So this is not the throwaway sketch, but it's I'm figuring it out sketch, right? Maybe that's what it is for you too. That is some advice that I've been telling students a lot lately, because I've just noticed a lot of my students. Okay, that was our 12 minute. All right, let's jump to, we're going to do it a little differently this time just because I'm worried about our time. We're going to go ahead and do, let's just cut it in half. Let's do 6 minutes and then we'll do 3 minutes and then 1 minute. So let's set a timer for 6 minutes. And get started with a 0.7 nib this time. Oh, but I was starting to say some advice that I've been sharing with a lot of my in-person classes lately is, I just noticed that whenever I've got an assignment where we are feeling a little more product-based, like a portrait, for example, we're going to work on a portrait. I teach all the basics of portrait painting and drawing and everything. And then I kind of, release everybody to get started. I'll look around the room and so many people just start going to the final product. Like they go straight from, I just learned how to, I just learned like the generic, facial proportions of a head, and I'm just going to take my reference image and immediately start trying to sketch it on the canvas or sketch it on the watercolor paper because I teach a lot of water media classes. And I'm like, whoa, 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 y'all, come on now. Like, where's the rush? Where's the fire? Like if it were me working in my studio, there is no way I would take a photograph that I just got and immediately start sketching it onto the canvas. Never would I do that. I'm going to do some sketches first. I'm going to do some practice sketches. Like if anybody's ever got any writers in the chat tonight in the class, that's like, because I have some like published authors who have taken classes with me recently, and I've said to them, would you send your, that's like typing your rough draft into an email and sending it to your publisher. Like, what the heck, do a rough draft that's a rough draft that nobody needs to see. Like, that's your practice. Like, figure it out a little bit first. Give yourself a break. Like, who expects themselves to be able to do something perfectly the first time? I don't. I definitely don't. I mean, I definitely have jumped the gun and started portraits that way before, or final paintings or whatever, and it has never worked out ever in my favor. I have never jumped the gun on a work of art and had it just magically. Well, that's not true. I have. The magic does happen sometimes, but for the most part, that does not happen every day. And I would need to do a little practice sketch first. So anyway, that's my big advice, is have some throwaway drawings that are not like where you're not expecting yourself to nail it the first time. Okay, speaking of no pressure and all that, we got 2.5 minutes left here that our time has gone by, and I just drew these so big for the 6 minute. I'm going to go ahead and jump to my brush nib and try to fill in those big shadows. But again, we're not looking for a fully developed finished sketch of any of these. We're just practicing the art of implied line drawing tonight. And I'm looking for those big dark shapes. I'm using my biggest brush nib that I have in the set. And yeah, I'm looking for those kind of characteristics that stood out to me in that more detailed, the 12-minute sketch that we had. Got a minute and 15 seconds left. That's a good amount of time to try to capture all these little character moments of these roses. So yeah, what were like those moments? Start to identify those. Like, what were the moments that were kind of pulling your attention back when you had more time that you kept coming back to? Like, oh, I want to keep adding. Like, one thing for me was the texture. I kept wanting to add some stippling in there and get the texture on the rose petals that was feeling stippled to me. So got a little bit of time to try to add some of that and some of these more dramatic moments here where I kind of scribbled in. I'm just kind of randomly stippling now because I think it looks cool. I'm just like, where can I put some more stipple dots? Oh, there were these little, this fun little leaf that sticks out, feels like very thorny in the front. Okay. Hopefully y'all aren't getting sick of my timer alarm here. I tried to make it not the one that I wake up to on purpose. All right, let's jump to 3 minutes. We're going to cut it in half again, and then we'll do 1 minute. So 3 minutes on the clock. And I'm just going to use my brush nib this time. All right, I started the clock. And this time I'm just looking for those 10 values at first. And those little character moments, like the little sticky outy things like this little moment. This is what I'm looking at, like right here, and like this thing, and this little dramatic moment. Like those are my three, if I had to say my like top 3 moments on these roses that catch my eye the most here. And then the shadows, those big shadow shapes. So I'm gonna go ahead and get those in. And yeah, try to make it kind of a game. We talked about it being kind of playful, like a game at the beginning of the class. So rather than feeling like, oh my God, this anxiety to, fill in the blank with whatever the anxiety is, treat it like, let's just see how far I can get in 3 minutes with these roses. So like try to, get at least something of every aspect of this photograph in there. So like even if you run out of time, you've at least gotten the vague idea of the roses all the way around, because that makes it a little more like a game. If the object is to at least capture the entire image in 3 minutes, it doesn't have to have detail, it doesn't have to have all the value or texture or anything. But maybe I could go ahead and we got less than a minute left here now, 52 seconds. Maybe I could go ahead and put some little stipple dots, since that gave it so much character before. And maybe I could go ahead and fill in some of those more dramatic moments really quickly. Maybe I could still get the shadows filled in. Got 27 seconds left. I bet I can fill in these shadows. And then with my remaining 16 seconds, I'm just going to add more stippling dots because that just looks cool to me. Or maybe some scribbles here in the center. Okay. That was our 3-minute rose sketch. So now let's go to the 1 minute. timer. And I'm sticking with my brush nib. Actually, I'm going to switch to the small nib just because, or the small brush. SB, if I can find it. Y'all are getting a few extra seconds real quick because I have not started the timer yet. There it is. Okay, starting the 1 minute timer now. So I'm just going straight for the drama again. But this time, even more drama. Faster, faster drama. And I'm really leaning on that variation in the line weight. About 20 seconds left. I hope me saying the time is not adding to the pressure. Some people like it and some people don't want to know how much time is left. Can't please everyone. All right. That was 1 minute for the roses. I know that was more complicated than the feather. It got harder on purpose. All right, how'd y'all do? You want to hold them up and that's my small brush. Oh, I see some good examples. Yeah, I'm going to spotlight you because I can. All right, that's Brittany. Really nice. Wow, that's the 3 minute. Got a lot in 3 minutes. I'm impressed. All right, and this is Barbara. Wow, Barbara, I love it when they're all on one page. That is so fun. Oh, I love that. Yeah, y'all please share these on somewhere and tag me. This is Mike and Cindy. I'm gonna replace Barbara. Look at that. Really nice. It's the 3 minute and the 1 minute. All right. Who else? Ooh, LJ, let me spotlight you. Oh, I love that messy, scribbly thing that's happening there. All right. And this is, oh, it's Carol. Hi, Carol. How are you? Love it. Yes. Got them all on one page. Look at how loose and fun that 1 minute is. I love it. All right, let me spotlight one more. I could spotlight more than this, but oh, I love it, Claire. I like that you're using some different gray pens in there, the little grayscale. Well, dang, now I'm seeing more examples I want to spotlight. This is Victoria. Oh, you got them all on 2 pages there. See the feathers and the roses. Really lovely work. All right, I could keep spotlighting, but now I got to find myself again. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chanel. All right. So now the Luna moss. I really debated on what this third one was going to be when I was prepping for this class. I tried out a few different things and then I was like, and then I found this picture of the Luna moss that my ex-husband had sent me a while back and was like, do I have your permission to use this Luna moss? And he said yes. So, all right, I'm just forgetting, like, I think I drew it oriented this way and then maybe switched at some point. No, I did portrait the whole time. I thought I had drawn it landscape. It's kind of counterintuitive. It looks like it should be landscape, but since the length of it is so long, I think portrait orientation makes the most sense. So you try it differently if in your sketchbook if you want. All right, we got 19 minutes left in the class. So I'm going to do 10 minutes. We'll do 10, 5, 2, and 1. How's that sound? That'll give us time at the end for some questions. Okay, starting the 10-minute timer. And let me start with my small nib. So this one is very light compared to the drama in the other two. We had some like really big, dark, shadowy shapes in the other one. And this one, the background's nice and dark, but the moth itself is very light. So we're really having to think about our blank paper, what we're leaving blank, what we're leaving as the light. So, but let's go ahead and go general to specific. Here is always the best policy. So we'll get that kind of big umbrella shape going. And then, there's some overlapping layers here. And I think it's fine if you end up drawing some black lines where some lighter shapes are happening, because we are kind of doing more of an illustrator style here thing tonight. So, doesn't have to be the most realistic Luna moth. And plus the background is so dark. So even though, the shape itself is very light, it's almost like you're drawing the line that's created by the contrast of the background. So, and for some reason, my lines are not showing up yet. All right. And it's okay if we're a little wobbly with these shapes at first, and we're not quite capturing them in a wispy way. I really felt like the first time I drew this moth, I was not capturing the ethereal nature of it like I wanted to. I'm gonna turn off my ring light for a second. Sometimes that ring light just does not help with my drawing illuminations. All right, and then we've got all these interesting moments up here on the head of the moth. And there's a lot of really interesting textures happening up here. So there's, we can really play around with the use of stippling as we go along. But for now, I'm just kind of capturing these what feel like little light bulbs hanging off here. I do not know the scientific names for all of the parts of the Luna moth. If anybody wants to put them in the chat, if you know, that would be really fun. I'm just looking for those dark shapes, and then I'm going to go ahead. We got 6 minutes and 45 seconds here. I'm going to go ahead and take the time to stipple in all this fun texture that I'm seeing up here. And maybe I could even switch to that bigger nib. Like that was my 0.3. I'm going to switch to my FH that I like so much, so I can more quickly add some of this value. And there's a lot of variation here where it gets a little darker on these little light bulbs. I'm calling them light bulbs. They feel like light bulbs hanging down. Feels like a street lamp. And then there's also some really fun, what you could add, stippling on the wings here. More interesting textures. And then down here as well, like the more you look at it, there's a lot more dark shapes start to jump out at you. And then there's this little crack in the wing right there. That could be one of those things that grabs your attention in these shorter timed drawings. Maybe we put some hatching lines up here on the head. So again, we're just familiarizing ourselves with all the interesting parts and values. There's some interesting textures happening all along these edges that you could emphasize a little more. I also, in my other example, I like put this shadow in there just because the shadow I felt like was so helpful with the roses. And yeah, if you're not seeing it, there is a pretty big shadow falling across what looks like canvas that the moth is laying on. So having the shadow can really help to like add some drama since things are so light. And maybe we do a little diagonal hatching line across the shadow. And going the same direction with the hatching lines down here can help us have some unity in this drawing. And that's another device that you can use when you're trying to like quickly capture the essence of something. Like use a diagonal hatching line across all those big shadowy shapes, and then use the same directional, hatching lines, and that'll just kind of, as we glance at it, we'll pull it together. Our eyes will read it as one image really quickly. And also that can help us get that little crack in there too, to emphasize that shadow underneath it. Otherwise that crack kind of looks a little funny, just floating there by itself without the shadow to weight it down. And then the closer we look, we've got these little wispy moments. Maybe I should have switched back to my smaller nib pen for these since they're so light. It really does feel like an umbrella here. And we still have 2 minutes, 45 seconds. And again, I'm like going to be a turd and say, I've gotten really far in my drawing. And then y'all might be like, well, good for you. Hopefully you're satisfied with where you're landing on all of these by the end of the time. And then, when we're done with this class, feel free to, take as much time as you want to draw all of these things. I'm not the boss of you. You can always do whatever you want later. Again, the timed exercises were just to help us with capturing the essence of an image in a loose style, trying to loosen us up. Yeah, stippling is my best friend with this moth. If I had, no time constraints to draw this thing, I would stipple a lot of it because that's how I think you could really just capture the elegance of it. Is I would even just do a really slow, gradual, stipple for like all of this texture that's happening here, because the lines are just so delicate and you could really just imply these lines by just stippling them instead of drawing the line itself. And really zoom in and capture all because it looks stippled in a lot of places. It just feels like it's already stippled. All right, less than a minute here, and I feel like I wanted to capture some of this down here on the little, I made this a little clunky. I think the next time I sketch it, I'm going to try to capture more of the wispiness down here, this little gentle curly thing that's happening. But that's okay. Remember, it's always good to have some like throwaway examples of a drawing. Like another piece of advice I've told people when they're, struggling with a certain subject matter, draw it on a legal pad in pen only, or, like get a $2 notebook from the grocery store All right, that was 10 minutes. But yeah, get a $2 notebook from the grocery store and do some pen sketches in there. That'll make you care less about what they look like. Okay, it's suddenly 7:21 already. So if we do 5 minutes, let's do 4 minutes, and then we'll do a 1 minute. We're gonna skip to the end here. All right, 4 minutes on the clock starting now. I wanted us to have at least one lengthier time to capture and study this one. There's just feels so simple at a glance, but then the more you get in there, there's a lot more complicated stuff going on. Okay, so there were a lot of nuanced things that I captured before, but now what are those most essential things? Like, where are the 10 values, the absolute black? It would be our little street lights. So I want to get those in there. We want it to feel like a moth, so we got to have those little antenna shapes. And then we need the little crispy tail part down here. And I'm going to jump to those big shadows. And then I'm going to jump to my FH pen that I like so much and go ahead and put in those diagonal. We got 2 minutes left on this one. So already I've captured the whole thing pretty much. I got the shadow in there. And then now I'm going to do some of those more dramatic moments. I'm going to put that little crack in the wing. I'm going to get at least some of the texture in the wings. Then I want to put at least some stippling in there. And I got a minute left, so I'm just going to stipple the rest of my time. And when there's 1 minute on the clock with this next one, we're just going to jump to the 1 minute one after this. I may not finish, but I'm still going to try to stipple at least something. So I love how time starts to slow down a little bit with some of these. Maybe you're not feeling that, but for me, I'm like, oh, there's still 20 seconds? Cool. Like, I'd call this one done if I had to. And it's kind of amazing how the more you practice like this, the more you familiarize yourself with a subject, how, you can quickly capture it. Not that speed is the most important thing, but, the understanding increases. All right, y'all, 1 minute on the clock. And I'm going to start with I'm going to use my small brush again. Okay, 1 minute, started the clock already. I'm like hovering, Trying to quickly capture that umbrella shape. Quickly put the little street lamps in there. They might be a little wonky, but they're getting in there. See if I can get the whole thing, and then I'll try to put those shadows in if we have time. Right, 13 seconds left. I said I was going to stipple if I had any opportunity to stipple, so. That's what I'm doing. All right. Boy, that went fast. Okay. There's my 1-minute Luna moth sketch. Pretty good little implied line sketch of a Luna moth. I'd love to see some of y'all's examples. You want to hold them up, and then now let me also open the chat and see if I'm going to let Chanel spotlight people and see if there are any questions I can answer. It's a little too much multitasking because I want to look at yours. Yes, look at that. I love it. Wow, you really captured the whole thing in a minute too. That one was a tall order in a minute, especially when we kind of jumped so quickly from 10 to 1. Oh, look at that, Carol. I love it. Yeah, look how loose and gestural that 1-minute one is. And I love all the stippling in your more detailed sketches. All right, I'm not seeing any questions jumping out at me. I'm seeing a lot of questions about the reference images. Lovely, Mike and Cindy. Really nice. Oh, and I love that you've got some stippling. Wow, you got a lot of texture. Yeah, you really studied it in that first one, and so you were able to capture it a lot in that loose style as you. I see somebody asked, is there something you can do if your pen stops working? Sometimes I like to keep around my pens that are drying up, and then you can use them for lighter textures later. LJ, that is a lovely, I can't tell which one that was. I'm assuming that's the 10-minute one. You got lots of detail on that one. I love how you captured the wispy end of the tail there, if you call that a tail on a moth, but you know what I mean. Lovely work. I see Victoria said, thanks for the tip on hovering. Ooh, look at this example. Who is that, Brittany? That is gorgeous. Yeah. Wow, that is impressive on that 1 minute, how much detail you were able to capture there. Did you keep working after that minute was over? I'm just kidding. Oh, that's your 10-minute. I'm sorry. Okay. I got confused since it was next to the 4-minute. That's lovely. I love how delicate your lines are. Can I see your 1 minute? Can you flip to it? Sorry for accusing you of that it matters. Oh, yeah. I love it. Yes. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. See, y'all are implied line drawing experts now. All right. Well, we just hit the 7:30 mark.
This is the last one.
Oh, okay. Autumn. Ooh, I love all that texture. Really nice work, y'all. Okay, well, I wasn't seeing any questions about, anything other than the supply list and stuff, so I'm glad we saved it until the end. Thank you all so much for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next week for the line weight class, where we'll be doing a similar thing, doing blind contour line drawings to help us understand line weight. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.